January of 1892 buried eastern Colorado, beneath a cold most people in Bitter Creek Crossing had never seen before. Wind ripped stable doors from their hinges. Snow blasted sideways across the plains like white sand. Breath froze in the air before a man could finish exhaling. All across town, people burned whatever they could find to stay alive. Chairs, fence boards, cabinet shelves. Furnaces roared day and night, yet frost still crawled along bedroom walls. Smoke filled houses thick enough to wake coughing children before dawn. Coal bins dropped lower every morning, and at the far edge of town sat a small sod cabin with no smoke rising from its roof. No stacked firewood, no chopping axe, no orange firelight behind the windows. Yet inside, two children slept peacefully beneath wool blankets while their father quietly repaired a torn glove beside a warm stone platform. Outside, an entire town was freezing toward death. But beneath Quentin Mercer's cabin, deep below the snow and frozen prairie grass, the earth was still breathing. 5 months before the great blizzard buried Bitter Creek Crossing beneath white silence, Quentin Mercer arrived with almost nothing left to lose. The wagon creaked badly with every rut in the road. One tired brown horse pulled it forward through the dry autumn grass, while cold wind rolled down from the northern plains earlier than usual that year. Inside the wagon sat Quentin's entire life. It wasn't his meager belongings, but the two small souls huddled on the seat. His son Eli tried to sit upright like a grown man to share his father's burden, even when exhaustion pulled heavily at his eyes. Right beside him, 6-year-old June had fallen asleep, curled safely into Quentin's frayed, oversized coat. Looking at them, Quentin felt his chest tighten. They were his flesh and blood, his whole world, the absolute only reason he refused to give up. Tucked tightly beneath the children's feet were his few material possessions. A wooden toolbox with broken handles, a rusted tin bucket full of bent nails, 2 blankets, a cast-iron cooking pot, and folded carefully beneath the seat, Lydia Mercer's gray wool scarf. She had died the previous spring, after a long winter sickness settled deep in her lungs. Quentin had spent nearly every dollar trying to keep her alive. By the time the ground thawed, the doctor was gone, the money was gone, and the farm they rented in Kansas was gone with it. All Quentin still had were his hands and a burning need to protect his kids. For years he had repaired windmills, dug root cellars, and patched storm-damaged barns across small prairie farms. Hard work had never frightened him, but grief had hollowed him out in quieter ways. Neither child asked when they would finally have a real home again. They simply trusted him in silence. People in Bitter Creek watched the wagon pass with the same expression usually reserved for men already beaten by winter before the first snow ever touched the ground. And high above the plains, the season that would judge all of them was already moving south. Silas Brome, the grain merchant who owned the largest storage house in Bitter Creek Crossing, offered Quentin winter work 3 days after he arrived. The arrangement sounded generous on the surface. Clean the grain warehouse, repair broken fencing, sleep in a narrow room behind the horse stable until spring. Most men in Quentin's position would have accepted immediately. He did not. Instead, Quentin spent nearly every dollar he still carried on a strip of land at the far edge of town where almost nobody wanted to live. The ground there was hard with shale rock. Wind crossed it without interruption all year long. There were no large trees nearby for firewood, no hills to break the storms coming down from the plains. People called the land useless. But Quentin barely looked at the trees. He studied the ground. One cold afternoon, he walked behind the property near a dry creek bed and drove a shovel into the earth. The top layer felt sharp with frost, hard, bitter, dead. But deeper down, the soil changed. The temperature steadied. Quentin crouched there silently and pressed his rough hand into the darker dirt beneath the frozen crust. Then he remembered something his father used to say while digging root cellars across Kansas prairie farms. Winter only kills what stays above ground. Quentin said nothing after that. He simply kept digging deeper. Quentin Mercer did not build the cabin first. That was the part people remembered years later. Most settlers started with walls. Quentin started with trenches. He spent the first week cutting 4 long channels through the hard prairie ground north of the property where winter wind struck the plains with the most force. Each trench stretched more than 50 feet through shale-heavy dirt and dropped nearly 4 feet deep before sloping gradually downward towards small collection pits lined with stone. The shape looked strange from above, like the ribs of some giant animal buried beneath the grass. Eli carried loose rock in a feed sack almost too heavy for him to lift properly. June sat nearby bundling dry prairie grass with twine, while cold wind tangled strands of hair across her face. By nightfall, Quentin could barely straighten his back. His palms split open twice during the second week. Blood dried dark across the shovel handle. Still, he kept digging. Before long, townspeople began riding past the property simply to stare at him. One ranch hand laughed from horseback. "You planning to hide underground when winter comes?" Another man called the trenches grave sites. Quentin never answered either of them. Most evenings, he stood quietly at the northern edge of the property, while wind rolled across the open plains toward him in long, frozen currents. Then he looked back down at the trenches and adjusted another angle, another slope, another depth. He was not digging blindly. He was listening to the wind before it tried to kill him. One night, after Quentin finally lowered himself beside the wagon fire with shaking hands, Eli quietly wrapped Lydia's gray scarf around his father's swollen palms without saying a word. A mile south of Bitter Creek Crossing stood Jonah Rusk's railroad salvage yard, a crooked maze of broken machinery, warped barrels, rusted stove parts, and scrap metal piled high against leaning fences. That was where Quentin Mercer went, instead of the lumber yard. He searched through the heaps for hours, pulling aside. Bent stovepipes, cracked clay flues, dented tin sections, and cut open oil drums blackened by old smoke and grease. Jonah finally walked over, wiping soot from his hands. "What exactly are you building out there?" he asked. "A barn or a junk pile?" Quentin lifted a twisted pipe section. "Something that moves air." Jonah frowned. "Underground?" Quentin nodded once. The blacksmith stared at him for a long moment, then laughed hard enough to cough. "You planning to heat a cabin with buried chimney parts?" Most men would have argued after hearing that. Quentin did not. He only explained what mattered. The pipes did not need to hold water. They did not need to look good. They only needed enough length for cold air to travel through the ground before reaching the cabin. Metal carried temperature. Earth held it. Movement did the rest. Jonah sold him the entire pile, almost at scrap weight. By nightfall, the story had already spread through the saloon. Mercer, the widower at the edge of town, was apparently planning to survive winter by heating his cabin with sewer pipes buried in the dirt. That same evening, June sat beside the wagon, staring at the heap of twisted metal. "Pa," she asked quietly, "are we going to have a stove?" Quentin looked at the rusted pipes for several seconds before answering. "No," he said, "but we'll have warmth." Quentin Mercer assembled the system one piece at a time beneath the open prairie sky. He sealed the pipe joints using pine resin warmed over a small fire, strips of oilcloth cut from old wagon covers, twisted wire, and clay mud mixed thick with horsehair to keep the cracks from splitting apart once winter hardened the ground. Nothing about the work looked elegant, but it looked deliberate. The northern intake sat low behind a rough cottonwood snow fence, where drifting wind would pile deep during storms. Quentin wanted the cold air trapped low before it entered the buried lines. At first, the system seemed promising. Then the first freezing rain arrived. By nightfall, Quentin noticed the airflow weakening inside the unfinished cabin. The moving air no longer felt dry. A damp earth smell crept through the pipe outlet beneath the stone sleeping platform. Water condensation. One section had settled too flat underground. Cold moisture pooled inside the line and slowed the current almost to nothing. That night, Quentin dug the trench open again by lantern light, while freezing wind rolled across the prairie hard enough to sting his lungs raw. Mud coated his gloves. His hands split open again beneath the shovel handle. Nearby, June slept curled inside the wagon beneath Lydia's blankets, because the cabin walls were still unfinished. Eli stood beside the trench, holding the lantern while his father coughed into the darkness. For the first time, fear finally broke through the boy's careful silence. "What if it doesn't work?" Quentin kept digging for several seconds before answering. "If it doesn't," he said quietly, "winter will tell us soon enough. Word about Quentin Mercer's buried pipes traveled farther across Bitter Creek Crossing than he ever intended. Most people laughed at the story. Captain Elias Ward did not. Ward had spent years around rail depots, army camps, and winter supply stations across the frontier. He understood enough about cold weather to know that survival was usually decided by small engineering mistakes long before men noticed them. So one gray afternoon, he rode out to the Mercer property to see the system himself. He dismounted slowly and inspected everything in silence. The direction of the northern intake, the trench depth, the slope angles, the patched metal joints, the movement of the airflow beneath the unfinished sleeping platform. Even Quentin noticed the difference immediately. Ward was not there to mock him. He was there to test the idea. Finally, the older man straightened and brushed dirt from his gloves. "It has logic," he admitted. That alone surprised Eli enough to stop working. But Ward continued, "Colorado frost reaches deeper than Kansas soil. Moisture will fight you every step of the way, and air alone," he glanced toward the half-finished cabin walls, "air alone may never carry enough heat to survive January." Then his eyes settled briefly on June near the wagon. "You're gambling 2 children against an experiment." The wind moved quietly across the open prairie between them. Quentin rested both hands on the shovel handle before answering. "Every winter house is an experiment, sir." He looked toward the buried trenches stretching beneath the frozen dirt. "Most people just use firewood instead of thinking." Ward said nothing after that. But when he rode away from the property, he was no longer smiling. And for the first time since arriving in Bitter Creek, Quentin saw something in another man's face that frightened him more than ridicule. Real concern. Only after the buried pipe system was finished did Quentin Mercer begin building the cabin itself. That decision alone convinced most of Bitter Creek Crossing that the widower had finally lost his senses. Men on the frontier built walls first because walls meant shelter. Quentin had spent nearly a month digging holes in frozen prairie ground before placing a single finished corner above the surface. But he understood something many settlers ignored. Thin wooden walls lost heat fast on open plains, and lumber in Bitter Creek cost more than Quentin could afford anyway. So instead of building upward like most homesteaders, he built heavy. He cut thick sod blocks directly from the prairie and stacked them layer by layer over packed earth and shalestone. Between the outer and inner walls, he left a narrow, dead air gap to slow the movement of cold. Flat stone slabs lined the lower sections, where drifting snow and moisture would strike hardest during storms. Nothing about the structure looked impressive. The cabin resembled a mound of earth someone had hollowed out by hand. One rancher called it a dirt pile pretending to be a house. Another described it as the only home in Colorado already halfway buried. Still, Quentin continued working from sunrise until darkness erased the plains. Eli packed wet clay into wall seams with stiff red fingers, while June carried handfuls of prairie grass for insulation stuffing. Above the main outlet pipe, Quentin built a raised sleeping platform from thick shale slabs, carefully fitted together with packed clay underneath. Stone held temperature longer than air. That mattered. The warm airflow rising beneath the platform would slowly charge the rock throughout the day. At night, the stone would release heat back into the cabin, long after outside temperatures collapsed. Not sharp heat, not roaring heat, steady heat. The kind that stayed alive while storms tried to kill everything around it. One afternoon, Abigail Brome, Silas Brome's wife, stopped her carriage near the property and watched the Mercer children smearing mud along the outer walls beside their father. Her expression tightened almost immediately. "Those children will freeze before Christmas," she quietly told her husband. Quentin heard her, but he kept working without looking up, pressing another layer of earth against the wall as carefully as a mason setting church stone, because he was not simply building shelter anymore. He was building a system meant to survive judgment. Late that evening, after the final wall section had been sealed for the day, June pressed her small finger into the wet clay beside the doorway and drew 3 tiny stick figures standing together beneath a square roof. By morning, the mud had hardened around them. The first hard freeze reached Bitter Creek Crossing during the second week of October. By sundown, water buckets outside the stable houses carried thin sheets of ice across their surfaces. Frost spread silver through the prairie grass. Every chimney in town began breathing smoke before darkness fully settled over the plains. That night, Quentin Mercer opened the northern intake for the first real test. Cold air disappeared into the buried pipelines beneath the cabin floor. Several seconds later, a slow current emerged through the outlet beneath the stone sleeping platform. It was not hot air, not even close, but it felt different from the frozen wind outside. Softer, steadier, dry instead of sharp. Quentin tied a thin strip of cloth beside the outlet vent and watched it move gently with the airflow. Then he crouched beside the stone platform without speaking. A moment later, Eli placed his hand against the shale slab above the vent. "It isn't cold," the boy whispered. That mattered more than heat. Cold stone stole warmth from sleeping bodies. Neutral stone did not. For several hours, the system held steady. Then, sometime after midnight, the plains wind shifted west. Quentin noticed the cloth slowing almost immediately. One branch of the underground lines had weakened. Air near the rear corner of the cabin barely moved at all now. The cabin was fighting uneven pressure. By lantern light, Quentin spent most of the night outside adjusting intake angles, packing fresh earth around leaking seams, and repositioning the outer snow fence to redirect airflow across the northern opening. The system was working, but barely, and like every living thing on the frontier, it would need to adapt if it hoped to survive winter. Near dawn, Quentin finally sat against the wall, beside the sleeping platform while weak morning frost crept across the small window glass. Eli and June slept beneath their blankets without coats for the first time since Lydia's death. Quentin stayed awake a long while, watching them breathe in the quiet warmth, rising slowly from the ground beneath the cabin floor. As October faded into November, Bitter Creek Crossing began feeding wood into winter, the way a steam engine fed coal into fire. Constantly. Silas Brome's large house burned through stacked cordwood almost day and night. Servants hauled logs across the yard before sunrise, while smoke rolled endlessly from the chimney tops. Captain Elias Ward's expensive iron stove kept the lower floor almost unbearable with heat, yet the upstairs bedrooms remained cold enough for frost to gather along the bed frames by morning. At Reverend Pike's house, things grew worse. Cheap green cottonwood burned wet and dirty. Smoke stained the ceiling beams black. The preacher's youngest daughter developed a cough that lingered for weeks. Dr. Miriam Vale began seeing the same problems all over town. Children with burning eyes. Old men unable to sleep in overheated dry rooms. Mothers coughing through smoke-filled kitchens before dawn. Winter sickness always arrived long before deep snow. Meanwhile, Quentin Mercer's cabin remained strangely quiet. No smoke drifted from the roofline. No ash collected beneath the walls. The windows stayed mostly clear instead of sweating moisture into freezing crystals. The warmth inside never felt fierce. It simply stayed. One morning, Eli woke before sunrise and stared at the tin cup beside his bedroll. The water inside had not frozen overnight. A few feet away, June sat wrapped in a blanket listening to wind scrape across the outer sod walls. Then she looked toward her father. "Pa," she asked softly, "why doesn't our house smell like burning?" Quentin glanced down, toward the slow current of air rising through the floor vent beneath the stone platform. "Because the earth doesn't need fire," he said quietly, "to keep people alive." By late November, Quentin Mercer stopped thinking about the buried pipe system as something that merely prevented death. Now he wanted to see whether it could support life. Using leftover cottonwood poles, scraps of oilcloth, and cracked window panes collected from an abandoned rail depot, he built a narrow lean-to greenhouse against the southern side of the cabin. Most settlers in Bitter Creek considered the structure ridiculous, before Quentin even finished it. Winter greenhouses belonged in seed catalogs and rich eastern estates, not on frozen prairie ground beside a dirt cabin with no stove. Quentin redirected part of the warm airflow beneath the greenhouse beds using a shallow branch line from the main system. The heat arriving there was weak, barely noticeable by hand, but the ground inside the little structure never froze solid. That changed everything. By the final week of November, Eli Mercer was eating fresh greens beside the supper pot while other families had already shifted almost entirely to salted pork, dried beans, and stale bread. June knelt in the greenhouse one cold morning and pulled a small red turnip from dark loose soil, while frost covered nearly every roof in town. The sight felt wrong somehow. Too alive for that season. One sunrise, Captain Elias Ward rode past the Mercer property and slowed his horse near the roadside fence. At first, he noticed the greenhouse glass. Then he noticed something else. Snow near the northern intake vent had melted unevenly across the ground. Thin ribbons of exposed dirt cut through the frost like veins beneath skin. The earth itself was releasing warmth. Ward sat there for a long time without moving, while pale morning wind drifted across the plains around him. Inside the greenhouse, June laughed softly after brushing dirt from the turnip in her hands. And for the first time since visiting the property, Captain Ward no longer felt certain Quentin Mercer was wrong. December arrived, no longer behaving like a season, but tightening like a vice around Bitter Creek Crossing. The cold ravaged the town. Panic took root in Silas Brome's mansion as his firewood supply vanished at an alarming rate. Captain Elias Ward was horrified to find that his expensive anthracite burned fiercely, but lost its heat almost immediately, leaving his grandson shivering beneath blankets right beside the stove. At Reverend Pike's house, choking smoke from cheap, wet wood was shredding the preacher's lungs. Cold kills fast, Dr. Vale warned as she passed houses echoing with violent coughs. But the smoke almost never misses. In stark contrast to the town's suffocating misery, Christmas in Quentin Mercer's sod cabin passed in quiet peace. There was no tree, no lavish meals, and no smoke-filled rooms. There was only a simmering pot of bean stew and a gentle warmth rising from the stone floor. That night, June hung one of her mother's old ribbons on the dirt wall. She slipped under her blankets, looking around the dimly lit room. "Do you think Ma would have liked this house?" Quentin looked at the hidden floor vents, then down at his own cracked, bleeding hands. "Your Ma would have liked the fact that it keeps you alive," he answered softly. But nature left no one in peace. As January arrived, the winter grew brutal enough to break every limit of endurance. The railroad was buried. Supplies ran dry. Pushed to absolute desperation, Silas Brome was finally forced to burn his own tables, cabinets, and furniture, feeding them to the fire just to keep a fading pulse of heat alive in his mansion. That same ferocity pushed the sod cabin to the brink. The earth's warmth was beginning to tire. The system wasn't magic. It was a machine that demanded sacrifice. One night, field mice blocked a pipe, forcing Quentin to climb down into the freezing mud trench. He cleared the debris barehanded in a screaming blizzard, while Eli stood shivering above, holding a lantern. As the core ground temperature dropped, Quentin had to shut off secondary vents, hoarding every last breath of heat for the stone platform where his children slept. Every night, he stayed awake, pressing his palm flat against the stone to guard the borderline of survival. If the rock went cold, death would step in. And then, January 19th fell upon them. The Colorado sky turned an unnatural, sickly, gray-green. This was no longer weather. It was a slaughter. The wind screamed like tearing sheet metal, blasting razor-sharp streams of snow sideways across the plains. Temperatures plummeted below 35 degrees under zero. Window glass shattered. Cattle froze standing up, turning into ice sculptures. The entire town collapsed under nature's absolute fury. Inside the cabin, Quentin scrambled to pack fresh earth along the door seams and wrapped heated stones around his children's bedrolls. Listening to the screaming rage outside, Quentin finally admitted what he had been trying to deny for months. This was no longer an experiment. From this moment on, every breath of air rising from the earth was the only thing standing between his children and death. The first furnace died at the Brome house shortly after midnight. Men had fed furniture into the firebox for hours, trying to keep the large rooms alive against the cold, table legs, cabinet shelves, broken bed frames from storage. But the storm outside consumed heat faster than wood could replace it. By 1 a.m, the fire collapsed into weak red ash. The house began freezing almost immediately. Across town, Captain Elias Ward sat beside the last of his coal, watching his grandson wrapped beneath blankets near the stove. The boy had stopped shivering 20 minutes earlier. That frightened the old soldier more than the storm itself. Bodies near death often stopped shaking before the end. At Reverend Pike's house, The preacher could barely breathe. Every cough sounded wet and deep inside his chest. His wife finally wrapped him in blankets, tied a rope to an old sled, and dragged him into the blizzard, because staying inside meant waiting for death to arrive slowly. One by one, families began moving through the storm toward the only cabin in Bitter Creek Crossing without smoke rising from its roof. The Mercer place. Wind buried footprints almost as fast as they appeared. Snow blasted sideways across faces hard enough to leave skin bleeding raw. Several people nearly passed the cabin in the dark because the sod walls blended into the white landscape around them. Then, someone reached the door and knocked. Inside, Quentin Mercer looked up from the vent controls beneath the stone platform. Eli stood behind him, holding June close beneath a blanket, while the storm hammered the outer walls like fists. Another knock came, desperate this time. Quentin opened the door. Soft, warm air spilled outward into the freezing darkness. Not roaring heat, not furnace heat, living heat. Behind Quentin, the stone floor still carried warmth beneath bare feet. The cabin smelled faintly of earth and stew instead of smoke and ash. Silas Brome stood outside with ice frozen into his beard. Reverend Pike slumped half-conscious on the sled behind his wife. Captain Ward held his grandson against his chest beneath layers of coats and wool. No one apologized. Not then. The cold had already crushed pride flat long before any of them reached the cabin door. For several seconds, Captain Ward simply stood there staring into the sod cabin he once called a winter grave. Then he stepped across the threshold, carrying the nearly unconscious boy into the quiet warmth rising from beneath Quentin Mercer's floor. By the time the last family forced its way through the storm and into Quentin Mercer's cabin, 23 people were crowded inside a structure built for 3. The air changed almost immediately. Wet coats steamed slowly near the walls. Melted snow dripped onto the packed dirt floor. Breath thickened the cabin with dampness and human heat. Children cried softly from exhaustion, while wind hammered the sod walls hard enough to shake dust loose from the ceiling beams. Yet the cabin still held warmth. Not furnace heat, not suffocating heat, steady heat. Dry enough to breathe comfortably, warm enough to stop death from advancing any further. Quentin moved through the crowded room without panic. He shut 2 secondary intake lines to preserve deeper ground temperature, slowed airflow through the primary vent so the stone platform could hold heat longer. Then he hung blankets from ceiling hooks to divide the cabin into smaller thermal pockets where body heat could collect instead of drifting uselessly through open air. For several hours, the system survived the pressure. Then near midnight, Quentin noticed the first warning signs. The stone floor cooled faster beneath bare feet. The air moving through the vents lost part of its softness. Moisture from wet clothing began weighing down the cabin atmosphere, with the smell of melting snow and damp wool. Too much humidity. Too little circulation. If that balance failed, the cabin would become a cold box full of trapped bodies before morning. Quentin crouched beside the main vent for several seconds, listening to the airflow beneath the floor. Then he looked toward Eli and Jonah Rusk. "The outer condensation pit?" he said. "It's choking." Neither argued. Minutes later, the two climbed back outside into the white storm, carrying shovels and a lantern, while snow blasted sideways across the plains, hard enough to erase the doorway behind them. Eli could barely see his own hands after a few minutes in the wind, but beneath the cabin floor, every life inside now depended on those buried fool pipes continuing to breathe. The storm did not pass overnight. It stayed. 3 full days of screaming wind and endless white snow buried Bitter Creek Crossing beneath a silence, broken only by shifting drifts and cracking roof beams somewhere out in the darkness. Inside Quentin Mercer's cabin, life narrowed down to heat, air, and waiting. Stew was rationed carefully, 1 bowl at a time, 1 child first, then the elderly, then everyone else. Abigail Brome sat with June asleep against her chest beneath Lydia Mercer's old gray scarf, while Eli fed small pieces of wood into the cooking flame only when Quentin allowed it. Captain Elias Ward spent hours staring quietly at the floor vent beneath the stone sleeping platform, watching it work. Watching invisible warmth rise from the earth without smoke, without sparks, without wasted heat rushing uselessly out through a chimney. Reverend Pike breathed easier by the second day. The deep, wet rasp inside his lungs slowly loosened after nearly a month of smoke-filled air. No one raised their voice inside the cabin anymore. The storm outside was louder than pride. On the second night, Ward's grandson finally began shivering again beneath the blankets. Dr. Diffew, Aswar Date, Miriam Vale checked the boy's pulse and nodded once. "That's good," she whispered. "His body's fighting again." Late that evening, Silas Brome watched Quentin kneeling beside the vent controls, adjusting airflow with bare, cracked hands red from cold and dirt. The grain merchant stared at him for a long time before finally speaking. "How did you know this would work?" The cabin grew quiet. Even the children looked up. Quentin sat back slowly beside the stone platform while wind roared against the outer walls. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then he answered honestly. "I didn't." Silas frowned. Quentin glanced toward the floor beneath them. "I only knew winter takes heat away from anything standing alone." He rested one hand against the warm stone beside the vent. "So I built something that worked with the ground instead of fighting against it." Nobody answered after that. Because outside the cabin walls, the Colorado winter was already proving him right more clearly than words ever could. Near dawn, while most of the cabin slept, Abigail quietly pulled Lydia's scarf tighter around June's shoulders without saying a single word. On the fourth morning, the wind stopped. Not slowly, completely. After 3 days of endless noise, the silence over Bitter Creek Crossing felt unnatural enough to frighten people more than the storm itself. The town looked buried alive. Snow stood chest-deep against buildings. Fence lines had disappeared entirely beneath white drifts. Several roofs had partially collapsed during the night. Frozen cattle still stood near shattered pens, with snow gathered across their backs and faces like carved stone. Smoke no longer rose from many chimneys. There was nothing left to burn. Then the door of Quentin Mercer's sod cabin opened. One by one, 23 people stepped back out into the frozen morning alive. Reverend Pike walked under his own strength for the first time in weeks, without collapsing into coughing fits. Captain Ward's grandson laughed weakly at something Eli said while sunlight reflected off the snow around them. Even that small sound felt strange after so much silence. Silas Brome remained near the cabin longer than anyone else. He studied the ground carefully. The snow around the northern intake vents had melted unevenly into long, dark scars across the white earth. Thin streams of vapor drifted faintly upward from the drainage pit where warm air still moved beneath the frozen surface. The ugly little dirt cabin at the edge of town had outlived every large furnace house in Bitter Creek Crossing. Abigail Brome knelt before June Mercer and pulled Lydia's gray scarf tighter around the little girl's shoulders before standing again. Her eyes moved slowly across the sod walls. "I thought this house would kill your children," she admitted quietly. Quentin looked past her toward the endless frozen plains beyond town where winter sunlight now stretched across the drifts like poorly pale steel. "Winter decides that," he said. "Not the money. Not the size of a house. Not pride. Winter alone." Spring arrived late that year. Not with warmth, with mud, burial work, and rebuilding. The people of Bitter Creek Crossing spent weeks digging frozen graves, clearing collapsed roofs, and dragging dead cattle out beyond the snowline before the prairie thaw turned the ground soft again. But something else changed, too. The town began digging. Jonah Rusk stopped ordering expensive cast-iron stoves from Denver suppliers. Instead, the blacksmith started forging adjustable airflow vents, pipe collars, drainage fittings, and intake covers based on sketches Quentin Mercer scratched into scrap wood with charcoal. Captain Elias Ward hired 3 men to excavate beneath his own house before the snow had fully melted. This time he paid attention to details. Deeper trenches, proper drainage slope, stone thermal mass beneath the floors, dry airflow before heat retention. He no longer treated the system like a curiosity. He treated it like engineering. Silas Brome made the opposite mistake. Impatient to reclaim status after the winter humbled him publicly, he ordered workers to copy Quentin's system quickly beneath a large grain storage building near town. The trenches were too shallow, the pipes too short, drainage almost non-existent. Within the first cold spell, Condensation pooled inside the buried lines. The water froze solid overnight and blocked circulation completely. By morning, the storage building felt colder than the air outside. That failure taught Bitter Creek something important. The buried pipes alone were never the answer. Understanding was. Quentin Mercer never called himself an inventor after the storm. He never claimed ownership over the idea. Most days, he simply walked from property to property, helping families adjust systems correctly before the next winter arrived. Sometimes, he tested soil moisture by hand. Sometimes, he studied how wind crossed open ground before placing intake vents. Sometimes, he pressed his palm against the earth itself, the same way his father once had years earlier on Kansas prairie farms. People noticed that he listened to the land before he ever touched a shovel. Late one evening, Silas Brome stood inside his failed storage house staring at frost gathering along the frozen pipe seams beneath the floor. Then he pulled on his coat, crossed town alone, and knocked quietly on Quentin Mercer's cabin door for the second time that year. But this time he had not come to beg for survival. He had come to learn. Years passed across the Colorado plains, the same way winters always passed across frontier country. Slowly for the people living through them. Quickly for history afterward. Eli Mercer grew into a quiet young man who eventually helped design water and drainage systems for prairie railroad towns farther west. People trusted his measurements because he understood something many engineers did not. Ground mattered. June Mercer became a school teacher. Every few winters, she told her students about the season when the earth kept people alive in Bitter Creek Crossing, though she rarely mentioned how close death had stood outside that cabin door. The Mercer cabin itself remained at the edge of town, long after newer houses replaced most of the original settlement. The sod walls sank lower with time. Grass eventually covered parts of the northern intake lines. The old snow fence collapsed decades earlier. But beneath the frozen ground, the buried system still worked, quietly, steadily. Quentin Mercer never became wealthy. No newspaper called him a genius. Most people simply remembered him as the strange widower who dug pipes beneath his yard and survived a Colorado winter without burning cordwood for heat. Many years later, engineers gave formal names to systems built on similar principles. Passive ground air exchange, earth tubes, geothermal ventilation. They used charts, equations, airflow calculations, and efficiency tables to describe what happened beneath the soil. But the core idea remained almost identical to the truth Quentin Mercer understood before anyone else in Bitter Creek Crossing believed him. Winter was never mankind's enemy. It simply refused to forgive arrogance. And long after Quentin Mercer himself was gone, snow still drifted softly across the plains outside Bitter Creek, while deep beneath the frozen ground, warm air continued moving silently through the buried pipes he had placed there with bleeding hands many winters before. Do you think most people today would trust the earth beneath their feet more than a roaring furnace in the middle of winter?